Hello and welcome to my wet paper recovery video. My name is Beth Rininger and I will be demonstrating some wet document recovery techniques using the assortment of photographic items that you see here before me and this bucket of muddy water, which turned out pretty awesome. It's actually just dirt from my garden, so it looks terrible, but I guess it's supposed to. It's supposed to be disaster water, right? So I'm going to be using an assortment of photographic materials. Let's see, I have a digital image just printed on regular non-archival office paper. I have some examples of silver gelatin photographs, things that were printed on photographic paper. Some are a little more glossy than others, so that'll be interesting to see how they react to the water. I also have a strip of photographic film. I thought this would be interesting to see what the water does to this. If it separates the emulsion from the plastic support, and in that case, if it's recoverable at all. Let's see, we have a couple of different size of catalogs, a thinner catalog and a very thick catalog. And two examples of just glossy sheets of paper with photographs on them. So all of this will go into the disaster water, and we will see in a couple hours what we have. Oh boy. What we have left, if anything. Oh my goodness. Okay, so welcome back. Before we take the items out of the floodwaters, the materials that we will need have been gathered, and we are in a well-lit, well-ventilated space with the windows open and the fan going, so we can get to work with these materials here. Mold, shockingly enough, only takes 24 to 48 hours to appear after water damage has occurred. So it's very important to control the environmental elements that mold likes to keep it from growing. They like high temperature, high relative humidity, stagnant air, and darkness. So the first priority in treating items is to treat the moldy items, or the items that might be moldy to begin with. Wet books, documents, things like that can't be air dried within a 2-day time frame should be frozen in order to inhibit mold growth. Don't freeze photographs or photographic negatives, however. Placing these wet items like books, magazines, in a commercial freezer and a personal freezer, it's not going to kill the mold, but it will put the mold in a dormant state until a time and an opportunity for treatment is available. So treating moldy or potentially moldy items would be the first priority in this treatment triage we have set up out here. So lucky for us, none of our items going in were moldy. So, and they've only been exposed to the water for a couple of hours now, about 2.5 hours. So mold isn't going to be an issue for us as we get started. So let's see what we have left to work with here. Up top, it looks like it's the non-archival digital photograph. The ink has bled off of the image, and even the water had like a pink tinge to it. Wet paper is very, very fragile, I found out. I want to thank my cameraman for holding the camera for me. That freed up my hands, both of my hands, to do this assignment. I'm wearing rubber gloves, and I also was trying to stabilize it as much as possible. I have 3 consecutive trays of water, with each tray of water being cleaner than the one before it. So the last tray would need to have the water changed more frequently than the others so that it's always the cleanest. Once rinsed, the paper should be laid out on a thin layer on blotting paper, or in this case I had a drying rack for baking that I put some paper towels on. So that's where this is headed next. Back to the disaster water, and I found that glossy materials like to stick together. So I was able to use a palette knife to kind of pry an edge, a corner up, and lift them off of one another very gently. The National Archives mentions a way of using a piece of polyester film on a stack of glossy materials, rubbing the polyester film and then lifting the film while peeling off the top sheet of the glossy material. And then you can hang the polyester film up to dry on a clothesline. And as the document dries, it separates from the surface of the film. That would have been helpful to know if I had had polyester film. But I did not, and I only had a small pile of materials, so the palette knife seemed to work just fine. Glossy materials need to be laid out in a single layer on some blotting materials or a drying rack. The heavier catalog, the thicker catalog, was extremely heavy when it was waterlogged, and it required extra support in getting it pulled up out of the disaster water. So now I have this huge volume, and if I can't get to it right away, I could wrap it in paper and freeze it until I had time to work with it, which is what I did in this case. For the smaller catalog, as you'll see, I'm going to be interleafing the pages, but you have to do that pretty frequently, and it takes a long time with glossy paper. So in order to hold this until I had time to work on it, I would wrap it and freeze it. Here I've brought the smaller of the 2 catalogs out of the water, and I've washed it and rinsed it. It's on a piece of paper that I am going to attempt to interleaf this glossy catalog. Very, very carefully, I used a palette knife to peel the pages apart, and then I interleaved, because it's a glossy material, I used wax paper or freezer paper, I think in this case, in between each of the pages to prevent them from sticking together. But I should do this with the expectation that glossy paper is probably going to suffer considerable physical distortion and isn't going to be perfect at all whenever it's dry. So that leaves us with a bucket of photographic materials and negatives in there somewhere. The problem for photographs and negatives is that water will cause the film to swell and the emulsion on the film and in the images to become soft. And softened emulsion is very vulnerable to damage from dirt, which can become embedded in the film, and to scratching and things like that. For prints, you want to keep them wet until you can absolutely properly wash them and dry them, or until a conservator arrives. And don't freeze them. And also don't leave them in the water too long, because the emulsion can separate from the paper base, and it can become easily scratched and damaged. Touch photographic prints on the edges as much as possible, to keep from scratching the surfaces as well. Paper prints can be washed in room temperature water and air dried flat, or dried in a blotter book. So some photographs are going to be more recoverable than others, and that's depending particularly on the process that was used to make them, and largely when they were made as well, I guess, too. In this case, we're using silver gelatin prints that are relatively modern, so they should recover rather easily. I found that if you're washing these, and there's this like dirt film that's left on them, if you use your fingers with the gloves, you can gently wash away the dirt that's there as well. But you should be working with a conservator or an expert. This is if your organization is like, we cannot afford this, just do what you can. Use minimal materials between your hands and the photographs when handling them, so that you can feel the emulsion and when it's getting soft. So if these were older photographic images, an ambrotype, a tintype, a glass plate negative, for example, I would anticipate the emulsion to be pulling and bubbling up. I would not expect them to be recoverable. You might be able to scan them into a computer and restore them digitally, but the physical, actual originals would be changed forever. So in the meantime, work with a conservator. Don't freeze photographic materials, because you could be creating more damage in your attempts to repair the damage. Here we have the negatives. They seem to actually be in relatively good condition. Not too much damage at all. Just need to be rinsed off, really. The temperature of the water that you're using is important, because it's black and white film. It should be between 62 or 68 and 72 degrees. And you can also use something called Kodak PhotoFlow 200, which is essentially a rinse aid that you use with the water. It keeps water rings from appearing on your film as it dries, kind of like a dishwasher rinsing aid. After you've rinsed the film, you can hang it. You should hang it to dry, ideally, by the corner. Not where the images and the emulsion would be. You want to hang it in a dust-free location, so a bathroom usually works the best for this purpose.